This has been our experience at Kutubia. We could say, like, we'll do translation, and in the end, nobody even needs it. So. But, you know, it's available for anybody who wants it, you know, because linguistic colonization is a whole separate question. Anyway, is it rolling? Okay, thank you, everybody, for coming. Welcome. This has been kind of put together very, very quickly because we want to take advantage of the fact that Dr. Ramón Grosfoguel is here with us in Andalusia. For a while, this is a short while, but he's going to be coming back, inshallah, soon for a longer period. So we really look forward to getting, to really taking advantage of, I don't want to keep using this term, but, you know, aprovechar from his knowledge, because Dr. Ramón is a professor, currently professor at Berkeley University in California. And you've been there for how many years?
24 years.
24 years. And for 15, he's been coming every summer to Granada to do a course around decolonization and relating it specifically to Al-Andalus and to Granada. And also in Barcelona, right? You've been doing it in Barcelona too. So essentially, we want to be able to hear what he has to say and understand what decolonization means. We want to understand particularly his perspective, because he has a lot to say about epistemicide, which is the destruction of knowledge systems, and it's a tool of empire, it's a tool of colonization, and also how this relates to spirituality. So let's kick off. How would you? Assalamu alaikum. Ramón, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Would you like to just start things off by explaining what your vision of decolonization is and what it means?
Well, basically, a lot of the problems that we have in the world today comes from the history of colonialism. That is, we've been living for the past probably 600 years, if we include the conquest of Al-Andalus, because the conquest of Al-Andalus, in my point of view, is the beginning of the European colonial expansion. Many people believe that the beginning of the European colonial expansion was in the Americas when Columbus arrived there. That's not the case. By the way, a lot of the methods of conquest used in Al-Andalus were then transferred to the America, to other parts of the world. For example, this question about settler colonialism, this type of colonialism, which is different from exploitation colonialism, that is when the European colonial expansion gets to a place, you have exploitation colonialism, which is one form of colonialism where they are trying to exploit the labor of the people they encounter, or the settler colonialism, that they're trying to get rid of the people they encounter and occupy the land with their families, with their, and the settler colonialism, there is a high correlation between settler colonialism and genocide, okay? This form of modern settler colonialism, the modern forms, began here. In the conquest of Al-Andalus, here in Alpujarra, you could see the beginnings of this type of colonialism that later was extrapolated to United States, Canada, United States, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. I mean, we can go around the world and see this, Kenya. I mean, we could see. In some places, they colonize with the two forms. In certain regions, they will do settler colonialism and exterminate the population. In the other side of the country, they will exploit the labor. So you need to look concretely at how this evolved in every place. But I'm just using this as an example of a form of colonialism that began here in the conquest of Al-Andalus, and that we can see today in Palestine. Okay, and you could see the correlation between settler colonialism and genocide, because the colonizer is not interested in the exploitation of the labor of the people they encounter. They just want to get rid of them because they want the land. They want to take over the land. So this is just one example of many examples I can give you of how the world we live today is a result of that history. That is, colonialism is not an event. Colonialism is an era in world history. That is, the modern world is a construction of the European colonial expansion, and that European colonial expansion was done through colonial administrations in most of the world, and so another example is the structures of domination and exploitation. For example, the international division of labor. where you have countries that are being super exploited in terms of their resources and their labor by a few dominant countries of Western imperial powers, okay? And that structure is still with us. That hasn't been completely overcome, although it's becoming more complex because now you have rising powers, like China, for example, that now is kind of displacing the Western imperial countries. And that's, I hope that, that doesn't end up in a military conflict, but that's what they're planning now, trying to provoke some conflict with China. But anyway, the problem of ecological disaster, you cannot understand that without understanding the colonization. Because the problem of colonization is that it's not that they went there and then they encounter these people, they exploit their labor, or they take over the land, and it's that they destroy every civilization they found. Every civilization they found, they destroy. This you need to understand, because you cannot look today at countries of the third world as as some kind of result of some ancient thing, because the colonizer went there, and it's not that they went there and respected the culture and the structures, okay? And then we're going just to exploit the labor, right? No, they went there and they destroy everything, and then they build up something new. And that's why when you look at any country of Africa, Latin America, you cannot say, oh, look, they are this way or they're that way. You cannot do that, because it's a fallacy, because you're looking at a picture, you see, of something that is the result of a process, not the beginning point. But in the West, it's very easy to fall into this trap of essentializing the cultures of the people in the third world and that kind of thing, thinking, okay, these people are this way. No, they're not that way. They're that way because the French were there. They're that way because the British were there. And they brought in all the poisons of Western civilization to those places, okay? And now, a lot of people in the third world are just reproducing a lot of the things that the colonizers put there, you see? And so, or take the problem of the ecological disaster, for example. You cannot understand the ecological disaster without understanding Christendom dualism, okay? Christendom as a theology of domination, where they establish in the process of destroying Unitarian Christianity, they establish a dualism with Christian, the Trinitarian Christianity, through the Roman Empire. They imposed this dualism where the forces of the good and evil, and nature was considered evil, right? And anybody who was a dissident of the empire would be pushed to nature, you see, and would be pushed to evilness, and they would be crucified, right? Now, this got secularized in modernity with Western's modern civilization. They secularized the narrative of Christendom. My thesis is that modernity is the secularization of the narrative and structures of power of Christendom, disguised as scientific, as progress, civilization, and so on. But in fact, if you examine carefully, I can give you a lecture. I think I gave a lecture here that I circulated through the WhatsApp groups in one retreat here, where I discussed precisely, the sister was there in that lecture, where I discussed precisely the transition from Unitarian Christianity to 2 hours lecture to Trinitarian Christianity, explaining how the importance of this is that it's very relevant to the world we live, because a lot of the ideas we have on modernity, they are really the secularization of these structures and narratives, okay? So for example, this dualism of the goods and nature is bad because evil, that's when Europe fell into an obscurantism of more than 1,400 years, because any scientist working with forces of nature was immediately accused of playing with evil forces, and they would burn you alive, right? Now, here comes René Descartes, and René Descartes will talk about he established an ontological dualism between the human he would say men, because in Christendom patriarchy, women are always suspicious of evilness. So they were in a very ambiguous position and classified closer to nature than to the human, you know? So that's Christendom patriarchy. So this idea, this dualism, was secularized by Descartes, for example, and he will talk about I'm using human, he said man and nature, okay? And then he would say, okay, forces of nature, he won't use the theological term that they're evil from the demon and Satan, but he would say nature is wild, nature is, we need to exploit it, we need to control it, we need to destroy it because it's an enemy. Nature is perceived as an enemy, you see, but that comes from Christendom. It's just a secularization of the Christendom dualism and narrative. Now, you tell me, okay, Ramon, but what the hell you're talking about? What does that have anything to do with the destruction of life in planet Earth? A lot. Why? Because every technology has cosmology. If you are producing technology with the cosmology of the Cartesian dualism, you're going to have there the rationality of destruction of life. Because you have conceived this stupid idea that human beings are here and dualistically separated from the forces of nature that are over there, okay? And separate one control, we need to exploit, we need to even destroy, okay? So any technology you build upon that stupid idea, okay, doesn't have there the rationality of the reproduction of life. You don't take care or you don't have the consciousness to be careful about what you're doing with the technology you're building, okay? And then what happened? If you look at the previous civilization that they destroyed, none of them, despite the discrepancies, despite all the critiques we can make, all of them have a holistic idea, which is the concept of difference or difference within unity. The concept of Tawhid in Islam. That was there in Pachamama, that was there in Ubuntu, that was there in all the cosmologies of the Global South, despite their discrepancies, but it was an idea that human life coexists with other forms of life, and nature is not an enemy, nature is what produces our life, you know, and we need to create a balance. So every technology built upon that rationality have there the rationality of the production of life. So we lost this we've been 400 years now of Cartesian dualism, like building technology that have there the rationality of destruction of life, you see? And we've been 400 years now of repeating this everywhere, and we don't have like a critical thinking about this. Basically, we are, in a sense, continuing repeating this model, you know, where, because it became common sense, you see? In the common sense of other previous civilizations that they destroyed, it was clear that you have to be careful how you deal with the nature around you, you know, because it was understood that your life depends on all the life surrounding you. And if you destroy something, you're destroying yourself, you know? But it's this civilization that imposed this rationality of the Cartesian dualism that, again, is the secularization of Christendom dualism that was imposed and that have created this ecological disaster that we live today. It's not just that capitalism is a system that everybody wants to make profits today and they don't care about what happened. I just want to make profit and I don't take care of anything else. That's there, but that's not the only thing. It's also the cosmology that informs capitalism. That is this Cartesian dualism. If we don't decolonize from Cartesian dualism, we have our days counted in planet Earth. That's as simple as that. You know? This is why decolonization is such an important thing for the world we live today. But the problem is that we lost consciousness of where are all these things coming from. We don't have like a memory of where is racism coming from? Where is patriarchy coming from? I'm sorry, but the patriarchy that was globalized and that now you see everywhere, okay, is Christendom patriarchy. Because the process of the European colonial expansion is a process of destruction of civilizations and imposition of their own civilization wherever they went. So whatever patriarchy was there, or whatever problem were there before, they were all destroyed. You see, that's why I don't see as a solid argument to look today at the global south or at countries anywhere and look at it as if what we're seeing is something essentially and inherent to the culture of those places. No, it's the internalization in those places of structures of domination that were imposed there by colonialism. Now, I'm not saying that the past was a paradise. There were problems, there were conflicts, there might be wars in many places. I'm not saying it was a paradise. I'm saying we cannot extrapolate what we're seeing today in those places to the past like that, because colonialism happened, and colonialism destroyed everything that was there, and basically imposed a new logic of domination, so racism, the ecologicide, no?
Yeah, ecocide.
Ecocide, the racism, Christendom patriarchy. There were other forms of patriarchy in the past, but that's not the prevalent patriarchy today in the world. It's Christendom patriarchy, the one that got globalized, you know, and was imposed everywhere. There were places with no patriarchy. That we have to also acknowledge. West Africa, the Americas, all the indigenous civilizations of America didn't have patriarchy. There were other places with other type of patriarchies. But what happened was that the European Christendom patriarchy either destroyed whatever forms of relationship that were probably more just were happening in places where there was no patriarchy and imposed their own patriarchy, and in other places they used the local patriarchy and embedded it with the dominant patriarchy. And so when you look at problems like woman domination, or you look at problems of racial domination, or you look at problems of poverty in the world today, you know, like a lot of these civilizations were wealthy. In the Americas, indigenous civilization, they were super wealthy. And they were more advanced than the Europeans in technology, science, you name it. But they destroy all this civilization, and then they come 400 years, 500 years later, look at it, oh, look, they're savages. Oh, look, they are inferior. Or look, they're primitive, they're backward. I'm sorry, you look history. You have a sense of history. You could see that Europe fell into 1,400 years of obscurantism, while the rest of the civilizations in the world were flourishing, okay, including Islamic civilization, okay, that have the notion of Tawhid, a holistic concept, okay, different from the Europeans at the time, okay, that had this dualistic concept of Christendom. And that led to a shift. The shift happened with European colonial expansion. They went elsewhere and plundered the rest of the civilization, took whatever they could. Then you see the rise of the West. The rise of the West is nothing intrinsic to it. It's extractivism, economic extractivism, but also epistemic extractivism. Okay? There's a lot of extractivism in the knowledge structures that they also took from other civilizations, especially Islamic civilization, because at the time, Europe didn't have science. So where did they get their science? From the neighbors. Who were the neighbors? Islamic civilization. So where did they go to get science? From Islamic civilization. And then you have things like, we celebrate Copernicus. I mean, history of science is a white supremacist history. History of science is just amazing. Huh?
Whitewashed.
It's just, I just can't believe it. How can they go away with this? They just attribute to a white man the origin of everything, when in fact, all this knowledge, they took it from elsewhere. Let's take the famous Copernicus case. He took this from the astronomer schools in Baghdad, in Damascus, where they have an astronomy school that they have demonstrated mathematically in diagrams, etc., that the Earth is not the center of the universe, it goes around the sun. He took this from them. In this plagiarism, he made mathematical mistakes that were not there in the original. But we still today celebrate Copernicus. Nobody remembers the school of Damascus. and the people who are there producing this knowledge. This is just an example. I can give you tons of examples about this. But especially if China would have been the neighbor of Europe, maybe it would be with Chinese civilization, but it was the Muslims who were in the borders. And that's where they took all this knowledge that was developed in Islamic civilization, and then the epistemic extractivism took it for their development of their own sciences. But what happened? They took it, right, and eliminated the spiritual part of this knowledge, okay? Producing Islamic civilization. But they did that not only with Islamic civilization, they did it with others, but with Islamic civilization was overwhelming because they had a neighbor, okay? So they took the spirituality out. So you have a science without spirituality, you have a science without ethics. If you have a science without ethics, you have a science with no limits. If you have a science with no limits, then it's a science where everything goes. And if you have a science of everything goes, you're talking about a science of death. That now science become the new church that have the authority to justify whatever. There's no ethics. So now science have no limits, no constraint. I can do whatever in the name of science, including putting at risk life in planet Earth, okay? With nuclear weapons, with all kind of crazy stuff that are being created these days, that, we're bombarded by radiation every day in a crazy way, okay? And you just look at your iPhone, you see all the Wi-Fi networks that are on your head, But the point is how science, Western science, became, they developed it, they destroyed the infrastructure of everybody else who were producing science technology through the European colonial expansion, destroying their civilization and the structures of higher education, the structure of knowledge production. They plundered these countries. Then they come 500 years later and they say, look, we have sciences. These people don't have anything. And then they bring a history of science that is a joke, okay? To justify that they have produced all this knowledge. And so I'm going over these things because a lot of the problem in Palestine, the ecological disaster we see in the world, the poverty we see in the world today, the problems of racial discrimination, the problems of patriarchy, the problem, when you look at all these problems that we see in the world today, we're talking about a civilizational crisis. But what we're seeing is the result of 500 years, 600 years of European colonial expansion, imposing a civilization that now most of us here don't feel that we are in a civilization. What are you talking about? We don't feel that. You know why we don't feel it? Because we are so embedded in it that we don't have a reflexivity or a self-reflection of the kind of, we are in a civilization. We are all embedded in that civilization. All these things have become common sense after several hundred years of, at the beginning, they did it with invasion, with force. It got internalized in everybody, including the colonized people. So now, we are all in, okay? And this civilization is a civilization of death, okay? Because this civilization not only is destroying millions of human beings, okay, as we talk, but killing them, okay, but also is destroying life. Because this civilization has the logic of that I describe here as the Cartesian dualism, that is the informing the production of technology, that have there the rationality, the destruction of life, So doesn't have there a notion of reproduction of how to reproduce and reproduce life, which requires a holistic understanding, not a dualistic understanding, you see? And so all these things, I'm calling attention to decolonization, that many people think of colonialism as colonial administration. You see? That's a mistake, a big mistake, because colonialism is not reduced to colonial administration. So many people say, oh, but why are you talking about colonialism if colonial administration have been eradicated from most of the world? Well, because colonialism is an era, that is an epoch in world history. And what happened is that with the colonial administration was the condition possibility of having all these structures of inequality that we've been describing here, all these problems. But once the colonial administration is over, because of the struggle of people in third world countries, for whatever reason, or the structures of domination put forward by the European colonial expansion got internalized in the countries that are now supposedly independent, and now people keep reproducing the same problems. You see? Keep reproducing the same problems they're fighting against. So many countries in the third world became independent, many times through struggles, through wars against the imperialist armies. But then, if you don't decolonize your mind, it's very easy to fall back into the same problem you're fighting against. You see the point? And this is what happened with many of the national liberation movements in the third world. They were Eurocentric, despite the fact that they were fighting European and North American colonialism. They were Eurocentric. So when they came to power, they started reproducing everything again. And then we are in many ways in the same place, because then all these countries became now neo-colonists. That is, we went from colonialism to neo-colonialism, where the West kept dominating and exploiting these countries, now with new elites that are going to be basically doing what the colonizers were doing.
Right.
You see what I mean? Yeah. And so that's I'm calling attention to this question because many times we are like feeling that there's something wrong. You see? We feel it. We see Palestine and say, oh my God, this is crazy. What is happening in Palestine? We see the ecological disaster, We see the crisis of nation states everywhere, because this idea of nation state, that began here in the conquest of Al-Andalus. That's another one that we need to discuss. This idea, this fictional idea that you have one state with one identity that corresponds one-to-one to the population in that territory, that's a fiction. That doesn't exist anywhere. So you look, in Latin America, indigenous movements have changed the constitution in Bolivia and Ecuador of these countries to move towards plurinational states. The understanding that there are multiple nations coexisting in the state, but there's no such a thing as a nation state. Okay? A nation state is a structure of exclusion.
But this is different from a federation, for example.
It's different from federation. It's plurinational state, different from federation. And they are understanding that we need to move away from nation state. Where did this begin? This began in the conquest of Al-Andalus, when they imposed this idea of one state, one identity, Christian, and one population that will correspond to this identity. Whoever do not fit this identity of being Christian will be forced to conversion or killed. Okay? Christianize or I kill you. That was the slogan. Christianize or I kill you. Right? And so this began here with a theological language. But in the modern world, that got secularized into the nation state. And now it's not Christian, it's maybe French or British or Senegalese or, look, people in the third world have imitated this model of nation state because of the Eurocentrism, colonization of our minds. And then you create all the problems you're trying to escape from colonialism. Now you reproduce it inside. Because now you have, again, the structure of one state, one identity, one people. I'm sorry. That doesn't work, especially in Africa, where you have like 20 different ethnic groups. You see, and then you have one that say, I am the representative of Senegalese, and then the others get out. But this is a result of the colonialism of the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spaniards. This is a result of several hundred years of colonialism. This didn't exist. The structures didn't exist before the arrival of the Europeans.
I want to bring it to the question of language, and it's really interesting you bring it to this. I want you to also have a breath. Take a breath.
Of course.
So one of the things we wanted to cover in this discussion was epistemicide and how important it is to understand this through the lens of Andalusian history, because as you mentioned, Muslim Spain and also the south of Portugal, Algarve, it comes from Algarve, Al-Andalus, and also Sicily. These were areas that were You could say very sophisticated, you know, in terms of their knowledge production, and obviously this depended on taking care of the land. I mean, you can't have knowledge production if you don't have responsible use of resources. I mean, for one thing, paper was introduced to Europe via Spain through Xàtiva, and paper at that time was made with cotton and hemp, so it's a product of the land. But this was like the main civilization that Europe was in contact with, that was very into knowledge production, and in fact was streaks ahead. You know, there was private libraries in Córdoba around the year 1000 that had like over 1 million volumes, whereas the biggest library in the rest of Europe was a monastery in, I think it was Switzerland, that had like 30-something volumes, because everything was being written on parchment, which is animal skin. It was very laborious, very expensive, and so on. So you can already see how knowledge systems are integrated into a holistic view of being, you know, living with nature, because if you're producing books in this massificado kind of way, like for a mass audience, you need to have a source of paper that is sustainable. So it's interesting that this should have been the place where this practice of epistemicide was developed and honed. And so I wondered if you would speak a little bit to that, because you know that in Granada, this was also a place where there were a huge number of books and people were very literate. Also, again, to go back to the Caliphate of Córdoba, there was free education for every child of any religion, even the children of slaves, who weren't slaves in the Islamic conception of slavery anyway. But all children were educated. Everyone, boys, girls, everyone was educated. They could all read and write. And even after the destruction of these vast numbers of books, you know, a couple of weeks later, there would be a copy of the Quran in every house again, because somebody had memorized it and they'd written it out by hand. So copying was also something was practiced. There was also copy houses that were entirely staffed by women. So there was it was embedded into the culture to read and write. But Granada in particular, it was this sort of culmination of this process, right, of various different Islamic or Muslim-run city-states, and at one point also a caliphate, but mainly taifas, one by one being taken by the Christian forces from the north, and the Muslims of Spain being kind of mostly concentrated, not all of them, but many of them concentrated into what was the Emirate of Granada, which was bigger than what Granada is now. It also included Jaén, Ronda, Malaga, and Almería, and eventually just Granada itself. In fact, the city was held under siege for a period of time. So you can see this concentration of people, and also their customs and their knowledge and their skills into this one city, and how the transmission of power into, again, as you mentioned, Christendom, the Catholic kings, they were very proudly describing themselves in this way, and how that had to result for them. They had to ban Arabic, and that was actually a very key part of their, you could say, civilizational attack, or the civilizational kind of colonization. So I wondered if you would speak a little bit to that.
Yeah. First, we need to understand very fast the contrast between Islamic civilization in this part of the world that we call Europe. No, I'm saying this because 500 years, 600 years ago, these have different names, but in the Iberian Peninsula, you have Islamic civilization. North of the Iberian Peninsula, you have Christendom. So first, in terms of knowledge structures, you have in one side, they will banalize the scientists because they were playing with evil forces. In the other side, they were celebrating scientists. Why? Because of the holistic concept. If you discover something in nature that we didn't know about, you're celebrated. This is not evil. This is part of the creation of Allah. So there's no problem in having science and spirituality. The problem of science and spirituality is a local European problem. The problem with Eurocentrism is that they think that whatever happens in Europe is global, it's everywhere. And that's a fallacy. Because in Europe, it's the only place in the world where you have a conflict between science and spirituality. It's the only place in the world where we have that problem with Christendom, because of this dualism I explained before. Okay? So the approach to knowledge was completely different. You're a scientist, you discover something in nature, bravo. We know something of the creation of Allah that we didn't know before, so you're celebrated. You're a scientist in Christendom Europe, and you discover something there that goes against the dogmas of the church, you're playing with evil forces. You're going to be submitted to the Inquisition, you see, and be tortured and killed. Okay? So So this is one. Rights of women. Women have the right to property, the right to divorce, the right to inheritance in Al-Andalus. In Christendom Europe, no right to divorce, no right to inheritance, no right to property, no, see? Relation with minorities or groups who are not exactly the dominant group in the Christians, the Christendom, they won't allow any difference because they were approaching the issue from the point of view of unity with homogeneity. You see, unity with homogeneity. Anything different is on the side of evil. You see, we are here and we're homogeneous. We're all Christian. Whoever is different, put them on the other side. They are evil people. They are in nature. They are
even if they're the wrong sect of Christian.
Exactly.
Well.
Even
Unitarian.
Yes, the Unitarian Christian were the most in Al-Andalus with the notion of Tawhid and the notion of is unity with heterogeneity, which means that you could have Jews, you could have Christians, you could have different faiths coexisting, you see, because it's a holistic concept. Also, we have to say that the famous hadith, Allah sent 124,000 prophets to humanity.
All of the different people. Yeah.
All of the different people. So, and also the recognition of the prophets of other traditions, you know, so there's no problem if you have a different, you know, you have a different faith, etc. So all of this was recognized legally with rights, etc. in Al-Andalus. In the other side, extermination of difference, right? Then you have the method of the encomienda is people who were conquered in Al-Andalus. Those of you who know a little of Latin American history, a lot of people in Latin America think that the encomienda began in the conquest of the Americas against indigenous people. In fact, it began here in Al-Andalus. They took the methods of conquest from here and took it over there. So la encomienda is a method where they force people to work for nothing, like 10, 14, 16 hours a day for the encomendero. Who was the encomendero? It was a Christian family who came from the north to occupy the land here, settler colonialism, and then those who survived would put them to work by force in a form of coerced labor called encomienda. Okay? And the encomendero will be in charge not only of the exploitation of labor, but also of surveilling conversion. They're going to watch if they're faking conversion or they are really converted, you see, to Christianity, to Christendom, you see. And so this method was taken to the Americas, the encomienda, and applied to indigenous people there. But this began here, you know. And so I'm going over several things like this. The concept of nation state that I explained already, that's there, where you have one nation, one identity, one state, with corresponding one-to-one to the identity of the population. That's a fiction. In Al-Andalus, there was a recognition of all these different identities, you know. So we can go on and on about this, but the method that they use today to really affect the memory of the colonized people, okay, is the burning of libraries. Okay? So they burn the libraries in Al-Andalus because that's, today we have a language for that with the computer sciences. Is you delete the program with the computer, and then you reprogram, you put new programs there, and that's what they did with the minds of the people colonized. So you delete whatever information is there through which they can access, so they burn the libraries. It's a way of deleting the memory. Because once you force them to conversion, after 2-3 generations, the memory is lost and there's no sources to go and find out what happened with my grandparents, you see? Now, and this is what they did here, but it's not just here, it's that they took this method of burning libraries and they did that with the Aztecs and the Mayas, who had the codices as the archival of their knowledge. You know the Maya calendar has the most precise calendar in prediction of solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, atmospheric phenomenon, etc. in the world at the time, in 1492. Okay? Nothing as precise as this one. But we don't know how they got to that knowledge because they burned the libraries. They did the same thing they did here. They took it over there. And so they used the methods of conquest from here elsewhere. That's why the understanding of the history of the conquest of Al-Andalus is so important. Because if the European would have conquered, Spanish monarchy, Castilian monarchy, to be more precise, would have conquered Al-Andalus and would have stayed here, then it's just an anecdote in history. Okay, another conquest in history, and that's it. No? The problem is that the conquest of Al-Andalus, after conquering Al-Andalus, then they went elsewhere. You see,
same year,
and they took the methods of the conquest of Al-Andalus elsewhere. You see, and that's why we need to understand and study carefully the conquest of Al-Andalus because it has a world historical significance. Because all the methods of conquest they've been using for the next 500 years began here, you see? And we need to understand this correlation. So what is it that they do? So they burn also the quipus in Tahuantinsuyo, what is called today Peru, there were brain surgery. There was, this is another thing we need to say. This idea that the people in these indigenous people in the Americas were these primitive people who were, this is one of the biggest fake news that I've seen in world history, okay? It's fake news, totally fake news, because Hernán Cortés, when he arrived to Mexico, what we call Mexico today, and he went to the Mexica, to the center of the Aztecs, you read his letters to the king, and he was like amazed because the engineering, the bridges, the buildings, he was nothing like that in Europe at the time. You have 500,000 people in a city with no plagues, with sewage system, water, everything. While here, the largest city in Europe have like 60,000 people, and they were with plagues, with all kind of problems, of hygiene and things like this. So he was amazed by the engineering, by the wealth, by the metal they used in the bridges and in the building was gold. So imagine, this guy was coming from impoverished, isolated village, such as Europe, in this case, the Iberian Peninsula. He arrived there and he's like, wow. And then he writes all these things. The letters of Hernán Cortés to the king are amazing because later they're going to invent a different narrative. They're going to say, oh, these are primitive, these people don't know anything. And that's a rhetoric they're going to use later to justify the conquest, you see. But at the beginning, you need to read Pizarro, the guy who arrived to Peru, and the conqueror who arrived to Peru, and what was he writing to his boss, to the king of Spain? Wow, Hernán Cortés, you read the letters, these people were like, you could see a description that later is lost, because then you have the theologians of the church, priests, coming and doing the chronicles of the conquest and inventing all kind of things, that these people eat other human beings, that these people sacrifice their people to the gods and kill them in total fake news, all this stuff, okay? Now, they burn the libraries. So we don't have now ways to accept the oral history and the testimonies of people from this culture and these communities. In Islam, in the conquest of Al-Andalus is different, because they burned the libraries, but the books that were here were in Timbuktu, they were in other parts of Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization was a corridor from Africa all the way to Mindanao, okay, in Philippines. So there were libraries everywhere. So you burn the libraries of Al-Andalus, they come up with fake news about Muslims, and then they fell apart because the evidence is elsewhere. But in the Americas, the only libraries were the ones they burned. From the Aztecs, from the Mayas, from the Incas, and so now we don't have ways to contrast like we can do with Islamic civilization, you see? To contrast the fake news of what they say about them and the reality of it, you see? And so it's as if we were trying to understand what is happening in Palestine today, reading the comments of Fox News Press or CNN. okay? Like we come 200 years from now and we try to study what is happening in Gaza today, and the only source we have, because they burn everything else, is CNN and Fox News. What kind of conclusion we're going to have? You see what I mean? And so, this is what happened with the history of a lot of the civilizations they destroyed. That we don't, in those places, it's not as if the Aztec have a library in the Philippines, you see? It was only there, so they destroy all of this, and that's it. Now it's the fake news that prevail. And still today, we keep repeating all this fake news, you see? Which is crazy, no? So the burning of libraries is a very important tool of epistemicide. Not just genocide, it's epistemicide. It's erasing the memory so that the colonized people have no alternative narrative except the narrative of the colonizers. And today, this is what we do. We repeat like parrots everything the colonizers say, like parrots. And this becomes common sense. We don't even have a distance, a little distance to reflect upon, okay, why I am thinking this? Why I think there's no racism in France, for example, okay? Why I think, this is a discussion I had previously, but which put me in it's a fresh memory. So why I think that, usually look at the Americans. Americans think that their power is innocent, that they're doing good, that they're always saving people, that they're always
bringing democracy,
I'm sorry, and if you say anything critical, it's conspiracy theory. And this thing of conspiracy theory, and I always tell them, since when you have powers that have no conspiracy? Tell me when this happened. Why can you see that in the USA? It's an innocent power that they never have conspiracy. I'm sorry.
All of
it's
those
insane.
Declassified documents of the CIA. It's like,
oh my God.
Wow.
My God. You look at those documents like, oh my God. All the people they killed, all the coup d'etat, give me a break.
In South America, a lot of.
Oh my God! All over the world, world.
Middle East as well.
And so this is always this innocent in the power structure, and the Westernized university. Look, I didn't say Western university. I said Westernized, because if I say the Western university, I'll be talking maybe about the geography of the West. I'm saying Westernized. Because the universities, everywhere in the world today, you have Westernized universities in Africa, in Asia, in China, in India. What is a Westernized university? It's a university where you're only going to be reading white man of 5 countries. That's what you're reading. You're going to be reading a French, you're going to be reading a British, you're going to be reading a German, you're going to be reading an Italian or an American. Look at this, please. If you don't believe what I'm saying, check the curriculum. Today is online. Go online and check the curriculum of all the disciplines in universities today. Man of 5 countries. Okay? You're reading a British, a French, a German, an Italian, and an American.
Yes,
okay?
So true.
And then you say, how did this happen?
These
now,
are the highest
it becomes
of knowledge.
Yes, and it becomes so naturalized that we don't even think about it. We take, okay, this is science, this is scientific, this is wait a minute, what are you saying? How come? It's as if the rest of the world doesn't think or haven't produced knowledge, you see? It's really very problematic. We are in structures of knowledge that are very racist and sexist, because you're only reading white man of 5 countries. And you are excluding even the women of the 5 countries. You're excluding all the rest of the humanity in knowledge production. That has a name. It's called epistemic racism / sexism. And that's the foundation of knowledge that we have in Westernized university. We're only reading that. Since when this happened? This happened only a few hundred years ago. Do you think that in Islamic civilization, when Islamic civilization existed, it was destroyed, okay? There's no more civilization except this one. That's why for me the clash of civilization is nonsense. Because there's no civilization that have survived the destruction of European colonial expansion. No civilization have survived. All of them have been destroyed and have been transformed into this crazy modern capitalist Westernized world, you know? And so I remember going to the Titicaca Lake, okay, in Bolivia, and going hours into this lake. I don't know if you heard about the Titicaca Lake in Bolivia. And I went hours into an island over there. Then I walk in that island hours. And when I arrived to a community over there, it says, tome Coca-Cola. Drink Coke. My God, I mean, there's no outside. They have colonized, you know, the most remote places you can imagine. They're there, you know, they colonized the world and destroyed the things that were there, you know. I'm talking about civilizations. For me, civilization, let me clarify that it's not just a culture. Civilization is a form of political authority, a form of economy, a form of relationship between humans and other forms of life, a form of relationship between male and woman, a form of the civilization has a cosmology, has a spirituality, it's many dimensions. Civilization is not just, usually the term civilization has been, in a sense, poisoned by the Western racist notion of superiority in civilization, always in a culturalist argument about how superior we are vis-a-vis these others, no? You destroy the civilization of the others, then you come back 500 years later and you say, look how primitive they are, you see? When you were the primitive 500 years ago, but you destroy everybody else, you are the only one in town doing science because you have forbidden the rest to do science, and now destroy their knowledge structure of scientific production, and now you come back and say, 500 years later, look how superior we are. These people are primitive. These people are inferior to us. These people are, come on, you know? So this is the problem why when we don't have a war historical memory, it's very easy to fall into these traps, you know, because you don't have ways to contrast. You just have the hegemonic common sense and all the narrative you heard and you have internalized, and you just repeat it as parrots. We don't take a step back and say, okay, why am I thinking this? Where did I get this notion?
Yeah, I really think this is the key to it, because to study history, you're obliged to look at sources and question sources and to think critically. And I feel like that's, for me anyway, that was kind of the origin of like my understanding of what critical thinking was, because it wasn't just criticizing everything. I think a lot of people think that, you know, critical thinking is some kind of like, oh, just critical people do that. Like you have to be really critical to do that. It just means, for example, like Hernán Cortés, if you can read his letters and read through, you know, or read through those chronicles and recognize this was a person with a particular position, they were writing to a particular person in a particular context, and there was some angle that they had. It wasn't just raw data they were putting down. It wasn't like pure information. It was, in a way, not necessarily in a bad way, but contaminated by their perspective and their reasons for doing that. So yeah, it's. I think it's something that's talking about epistemicide. You really feel like now we are in a position, civilizationally, you could say, where, you know, we're described as being the information age, and yet still there is such a struggle with encouraging people to think critically about the sources and to ask the questions, you know, does the BBC have a neutral stance? Does CNN have a neutral stance? Do any of these people actually have a neutral stance? But I wanted to bring it round. We did touch on it. We have mentioned the spirituality element of this. And so we've talked about the Cartesian duality, and we've talked about how, in contrast, the civilizations that this European expansion crushed and dismembered and destroyed, largely they had a holistic view of things, because they had to, because if you don't survive, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like this whole thing of, I think in China, they like the politicians are encouraged to think, you know, 10 generations down the line, like whatever you decide now, whatever actions you take now are going to be impacting people 100 years down the line. So you have to, you know, somebody, I think it was the French foreign minister was asked what he thought of the French Revolution. He said it's too soon to know. Mm-hmm. He just, because, you know,
showing life.
Yeah, like
he said that.
hundreds of years can go by. It's still impacting. And there's so many things I want to add and expand upon, but I'm aware we're probably going to start running out of time, and it's going to be iftar soon. But to bring it back to the spirituality element of it, and to see how, I mean, for me, in my research, I've been reading a lot about Al-Andalus and seeing how the people related to the land in a way that it really revealed, and this you see from all different Muslim sources, an awareness of the sentience of nature, and that plants, even rocks, have a kind of a sentience that you can actually communicate. And there's descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, rocks greeting him, and stones and trees, and he would communicate with all these different elements of nature, and that didn't seem strange to them. It was, now we're looking at it, we're like, whoa, that seems really crazy. Like, he hugged a tree because he heard it weeping. Like, now that's like, what? He's some kind of crazy tree hugger? But that was just natural to them. And so in Al-Andalus as well, that would have been a given.
Indigenous people in many parts keep doing that. Keep talking to trees, to stones.
Right, and
we look at them as primitive and as crazy or whatever.
Right, but actually in a way they're streaks ahead, because they're thinking in terms of, well, we're cohabiting, we're a part of nature, and nature is a part of us. So in a way it seems very kind of radical, and I say radical in the sense that, radicar in Spanish means to be rooted in, right? And even we have it in English to eradicate, it means to pull something up by the roots. So radical really means just going back to the roots. It doesn't mean going out there, it means coming back. It means going down into the ground in a way. How can we, given that this colonization is so expansive, it's so subtle, it's in every realm, it's in knowledge productions, it's in politics, it's in education, it's in art, it's in aesthetics, it's in the ideas of beauty, it's in ideas of gender, it's in all these different kinds of realms. How do you suggest we can counter this? I mean, especially coming from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah. I think that, let me give you an anecdote, okay? When I went to Morocco, I remember looking in mosque. There were signs in French and English saying non-Muslims cannot enter the mosque. Okay, so I was shocked by that. I was like, what? Because if you look further, in many parts of the Muslim world, you don't see this. Why is it that non-Muslim cannot enter the mosque in Morocco? Where is this coming from? Okay, I'm giving you this as an anecdote of what happened profoundly in our spiritualities and theologies, etc. This happened everywhere. So what we got, I start searching and I ask people, the imam in the mosque, etc., hey, why non-Muslim cannot enter here? And they will come with false hadiths, citing false hadiths, okay, to justify this policy, okay? So I went out and talked to other people there, and I remember talking with women who are working in Morocco. Some of them use the term Islamic feminists, others don't use that term, but I spoke with them and they told me, hey, this is exactly a good example of colonialism. Because look, where is this coming from? This is coming from General Lyoté. You know who is General Lyoté? He's the guy of the French army, okay, who colonized Morocco, okay? He's the guy of the French army who colonized Morocco. And he imposed this code. It's called the Lyoté Code. He forbid people from other beliefs to enter the mosque. Why? He was afraid that the mosque will become the center of the struggle against French colonialism. So he split the communities this way. Okay? Then at the beginning, it became like a custom.
Wow.
Then it became a habit. And then it became authentic Islam. And now people recite hadiths, full hadiths, justifying this policy as authentic Islam. People forgot where is this coming from. And they think this is authentic Islam. So I'm giving you this example just as an anecdote to give you an idea of what happened with our theologies. They mess up the theologies. So, well, in many ways, we have a colonial Islam. A lot of the Islam we see these days, in many places, is a colonized Islam. is the importations of the colonizers inside the theology of Islam. Okay? For example, you look at the methods of reading the Quran of the Wahhabis. Okay? Literalists, where is this coming from? This is coming from the British Empire when they did an alliance with the Wahhabis against the Ottomans 150 years ago, 200 years ago. And they imported the methods of reading the Bible of the Christian fundamentalists from Britain to Saudi Arabia. And they start using these methods to read the Quran. Now nobody remembers where these literalist readings of the Quran is coming from. Nobody remembers this now. But this is coming from a British importation, especially British Christian fundamentalists. Okay? Another example. Look at what is called reformist Islam today. Okay? In Al-Azhar in Egypt. Okay? And he was doing fatwas for the governor, the British governor of Egypt. Cromwell is his name? Cromwell, right? Yeah. He was doing the fatwa. Cromwell would say, I want a fatwa for this, he will do it. And then he started transforming Islam. For example, riba, that is one of the worst sins in the Quran. Okay?
Interest, like
he passed interest over money. Okay? He passed a fatwa authorizing riba, and so on. I mean, so now this Muhammad Abdul became in the name of reform because Islam has to modernize, has to accept modernity. As if modernity was something emancipatory. Modernity is a civilization of death. Okay? And now we need to become modern. And to become modern, we need to pass. He was following all the orders from Cromwell and passing the fatwa. From then you have Rashid Reda. From Rashid Reda you have Al-Afghani. Then you have Hassan, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hassan al-Banna. That's a lineage of called the reformist tradition. It's very colonial. It's a colonial Islam because they revise a lot of the theology, importing things from the West, thinking that modernity is good. Okay? I organize. So what I'm trying to say is that decolonization is not just fighting outer structures of the system. Decolonization is also fighting the inner structures. Okay? So we need to do is inner jihad, outer jihad at the same time. Okay? So decolonization has to go both ways. You need to fight the injustices of the system, the outer structure that are producing injustices, but you have to fight also our inner structure, colonial ideas, etc. we have imported in the name of authentic tradition. So we need to also do a work with ourselves as communities, as Ummah, to try to decolonize from these importations that today we're not even aware of. Where is General Yotefre? I give you that as an anecdote. What happened with everything, the theology, everything. They did this everywhere because, again, colonialism is not an anecdote in history. Colonialism is an era. And it destroyed whatever they encountered and imposed their structures of everything, including knowledge, into all the people around and imposed a civilization. And that was internalized by everywhere. So we need to work in the two directions at the same time. If you dedicate yourself to only deal with the outer structure and the injustices and you don't deal with the inner structures, you become a Eurocentric Marxist, okay? Where you think that changing the outer structures automatically will change inner structures, okay? And if you deal only with inner structures and you don't deal with the outer structures, injustices of the system, then you become New Age, okay?
Or bourgeois, kind of.
A bourgeois New Age, liberal New Age. No, really. So you have to go in both directions, okay? So, for example, look, when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was persecuted, okay? were, in a sense, trying to exterminate them, and so have to go to Medina, founded the first pluriversal state, okay? The first state that had the recognition of the different communities, okay? Then they kept attacking, they organized, and they had to fight back. But they didn't fight back just watching. They fought back with weapons, okay? In a war, okay? Against the outer structures of oppression. They were not just, but they did it with inner structures trying to not get internally contaminated by hate or by revenge or by this, but you have to fight back because it's a reality. You're confronting outer structures of injustices and oppression, okay? When he arrived to Mecca and conquered Mecca, he pardoned everybody. Everybody thought he was going to kill everybody, but that was the custom of the time, that they will kill all the enemies. He pardoned everybody. But he pardoned everybody when he beat them, not before. You cannot think that you're going to have mercy and compassion to oppressors if you don't beat them first. So merciness and compassion, yes, getting our heart clean and in the struggle against these enemies, you don't get contaminated by hate or by revenge. That's very important, the struggle. So it's a struggle in both directions at the same time. Again, if you only deal with the outer structure and you think by changing that, you change the human beings, you become a Eurocentric Marxist. That they think always that if you change the structure, everything will change and we will be happy. No, there are inner structures that we need to address and we need to transform. If we dedicate ourselves to inner structure and don't deal with the outer structure, okay, then we are in New Ageism, where you transform yourself, you do an internal transformation, and who cares about the rest of the world, If you look at the example of Prophet Muhammad, he's always in the two directions at the same time. Always. You see? Inner jihad, outer jihad at the same time. You see? And I agree with mercifulness against structures of, people who incarnate structures of power, being merciful, being compassionate, but it cannot be when they are in power. Because then they're going to crush you. They're going to destroy you. You see? You have to fight them back with merciless, with all of that, but then once you beat them, then comes the prophet and says, okay, I pardon you, but I already beat you. Now you're not my enemy anymore because I beat you. But if you do it before, it will happen to you like Mandela. Mandela sat down with the whites and did a kind of devil pact, okay? The guy who was, 30 years in jail, and did a pact with the white elites to create this so-called New South Africa that today is more unequal, more racist, more white supremacist than in the times of apartheid. We're now in neo-apartheid. If you look, I go a lot to South Africa. If you look at the black youth today, they are rage against Mandela. Because they say, why?
He sold them out.
Huh?
He sold them out.
Why you sold us out? If you look, Mandela was called a terrorist for many years when he was fighting the system. When he gave up, he became an image, a Gandhi. Like everybody, oh wow, in the West, it's like celebrated now Mandela, the guy who was called a terrorist, right? Now it's celebrated. Because we can understand what happened, but not justify. What I mean is, they, in a sense, manipulated him because he was in a jail for over 30 years, and then they were negotiating with someone who is in jail. Then they put them in a mansion with a swimming pool with all the luxury, you see? And then, okay, let's negotiate now. You see what I mean? Well, he was, I mean, you see, so he basically gave up a lot of the demands of the movement, etc. And today, South Africa is a disaster. Okay, South Africa, the inequality of South Africa is among the top in the world. Okay, the apartheid system was formally dismantled, but there are new forms of apartheid. That is the neo-apartheid. The society is still, the whites are still in power. White supremacy is still alive. You know,
The majority of the land went to...
the majority of the land went to the whites. People, there are movements, black movement, they're claiming the land because these are, the whites took over the land and now the black people still today doesn't have the land, okay? Not to talk about business, about many things. So, to answer your question, we need inner structure, outer structure simultaneously. One doesn't come first to the other. It's that the two have to go together in our struggle. And mercifulness has to be as part of a struggle, okay? We could be merciful, we could be compassionate to people who incarnate oppressions, but we cannot be naive. We cannot be being merciful like Mandela did with these white elites for them to stay in power and keep doing everything they've been doing. You see what I mean?
But it's not mercy.
Huh?
But it isn't mercy.
It's mercy. It's keeping the injustice in place. This is the problem. That in the name of mercifulness, you're keeping the injustice in place. You're not transforming.
I'm a little bit aware of the sun going down. How many minutes do we have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, wonderful. Do we have any questions? Does anybody want to ask anything? Now is the chance. There's been so much stuff that's come up. Thank you so much. This has just been like a serious download of information, and there's a lot of responses that I'm thinking as well, but I want to open the floor up. Yes.
There are so many questions to ask, but I'm curious if you can go a little bit more into what it means to decolonize the mind, like practically.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to, and so there are methods for that, which is, you could see it in many traditions. In Islam, you could see in the Sufi tradition, in other spiritualities, you could see methods. That's why I'm saying inner structure, we need to deal with that. You know, and for that, there are forms of decolonization of our hearts, okay? But at the same time, decolonization in terms of knowledge have to do with having alternative narrative of history, have to do with the critiques that historically have been made to Western imperialism, colonialism from the global South. Those knowledges, we need to incorporate those knowledge into our common sense, you know? So decolonization is also about in terms of the mind, okay? Because there have to be the decolonization of the outer structures, no? But decolonization in terms of the mind and our hearts requires spirituality, bringing practices of spirituality to decolonize our hearts, and then practices of knowledge productions that are critical, that have been produced by activists, intellectuals of the global South, female and males, okay, that have been critical. I recommend you, for example, one text of Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire is a black intellectual from the Caribbean, from Martinique, a colony of France. He was the teacher of Frantz Fanon, and it's a short text called Discourse on Colonialism. Discourse on Colonialism. That's a foundational text that I think everybody should read.
If you add your email to, we're collecting emails for the newsletter, but we have it as a PDF. You can send it as well.
I'm familiar with this text.
Oh yeah.
I'm curious if there are like epistemological tools that are really decolonized, because even in some ways, like putting a text together that is like, it's leaning on the same tools of the oppressor when you critique the oppressor in the same language and structures that have been used upon you. So what do those epistemological tools really look like when they're coming from a completely different decolonized mindset?
You know, actually, I'd love to answer this because I feel like for me, going to the oral histories is really important, and folk songs and folk traditions of folk music and tunes. Often they're female lineages as well. Many cultures, it's women who are the carriers and the holders of those. And like Dr. Ramón was saying, like books can be burned, right? But oral histories, for example, Africa, there were a few cultures in Africa, a few civilizations in Africa that had writing systems, but the majority didn't. And so this was one of the reasons why European colonization of Africa was so damaging and so destructive. Because if you kill the elders, then immediately you have you lose a huge amount of the knowledge. Those are the knowledge holders, the knowledge. They were the libraries, really. But in songs, because a song is something that is, and poetry as well, and theatre, because they're easy to memorize. Right, even Homer's epics, they were originally oral. The Jeliw in the Mande culture in various different states of West Africa, they have an epic called the Sunjata epic, which if they sing all of those pieces back to back, it takes a week. And they memorize it all, and the differences between one reciter and another is like one word or two words. It's incredibly meticulous. The memorization is incredibly meticulous. And so in some ways, like having the reliance on paper and written text is dangerous in that sense, because if you can memorize something, like Al-Ghazali famously was attacked by bandits, and he said, I haven't got anything but my books, and they were like, he said, if you take away my books, I haven't got anything, and they laughed at him and they said, what kind of a scholar are you if you're nothing without your books? And so after that, he memorized everything. So looking at that, like embodied memory and embodied knowledge, I think for me, and songs is one, they're one way that people recorded genealogies, the way that they recorded, histories and events in their history and things like this, but also their whole worldview and their ideas about things is, I think, a very tangible way of doing it, and you can learn that song and you can sing it yourself, and so you can become part of that kind of chain as well.
Yeah, I think there is epistemic diversity in the world. There are critical thinkers from different traditions, and I will invite you to get to know what they're saying. I mean, the critical thinking coming from other epistemologies, other cosmologies, other traditions, as a point of departure to do a radical critique to Eurocentrism. That would be my answer. I mean, but that requires that, for example, you get involved with some of the production of knowledge coming from different authors in the global south, so that would be like a way to decolonize our minds. Like, instead of keep reading the critique of the West to the West, let's read the critiques of the people who are in the global south of the West, and then that's a way to go, I will invite you to do that, because there's plenty of, today with the internet, you can get access to so many texts and interventions that are decolonial interventions that are useful.
It would be really interesting to write a book list, like a reading list.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely.
In fact, have you seen Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi Thiong'o?
No.
This for me was the first book that I read that really, it turned the light on. It's a very slim book, and he's a Gikuyu Kenyan writer, and he literally just writes about his childhood growing up in British colonized Kenya, and how, especially, this is very pertinent as well to this discussion about epistemicide, because the language itself, Kenya has about, I think, 100 languages, indigenous languages, but the British obviously leveled it all off, because and I actually taught very briefly in Kenya many years ago, and if you don't sit your exams, if you don't pass your primary school exams in English, you can't go on. So there was kids in year 6 of primary school who were 15, and they were just having to repeat every year because they just didn't have a skill with English. I mean, what are you going to do? You've never been to England, you like living in Kenya. So, I mean, that for one thing is one way of holding people back in a colonized situation. But what Ngugi says is, which is, I think, was so interesting, he talked about the school system as being like, they encouraged children to snitch on one another. So they banned their indigenous languages, first of all, any mother tongue. And they could only speak in English. But if one of the kids heard another kid speaking their native tongue, they would tell the teacher, and they would give them a button or a pebble or something like this. And then that kid would want to get rid of that button, and so he would be listening out for the other kids. And then at the end of the day, the teacher would say, who has the button? And then they would ask, who gave you the button? And so it would show like a chain of snitching. Essentially, the children were being taught to snitch on each other. And they would all have to sit in a corner with a sign around their neck saying, I am stupid, or I am a donkey. It really was indoctrinating children from that age to believe that your language makes you stupid. It makes you inhuman. You know, and so, like, I think, and one of the things that Emma Sezel writes in that piece as well is like, oh no, it wasn't that one. It was, well, several. I recently read The Colonized and Colonized by Albert Memmi, who is an amazing Jewish Tunisian writer. And he does these incredible, like, forensic character profiles of different kinds of colonizer and different kinds of colonized. And he talks especially about, towards the end, how important the recuperation of language, like the language that has been sneered at, and you've been told that your language is lesser, and you've been told that your language makes you less intelligent. Recuperating that language and those, you know, the forms of language, poetry, stories, you know, those are the things that will help you to kind of recuperate your sense of self from the colonial mindset that's been imposed on you. And another book that's really interesting on that topic is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And I think we're probably out of time.
Yeah.
Yes, oh my gosh, okay. Thank you all so much. ¿Tú tienes una pregunta también?
I would like to say something.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
May your fast be blessed.
Katia, you have something to say?
Yes. I hope I can do it in English.
Se puede también en castellano perfectamente.
I would say that decolonizing transformation is something about transforming your life. It is not about transforming your mind only. Because the mind is the result of the kind of life you have every day. So I think we have to focus on this, on the point of everyday life. What are you doing? Then what are you thinking? Because otherwise you focus only in the problem of the mind, and that's very Western. You know, so you are not decolonizing anything if you keep in that kind of perspective. So,
Decolonization of being.
Yeah.
Yes.
La decolonización del ser.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's something more profound, everyday life. So we have to, criticize our habits, our customs, our point of view. Because, for example, we look as Western, we look phenomena as objects. But, for example, if you think from original Indians' original perspective, they look at the reality.
Not original, the
as
native people.
native